Hello, it's Fred Dinage. Thank you once again for joining me, talking about crime and criminals and gangsters and killers. I want to talk this week about a man called Frank Mitchell, otherwise known as the Mad Axeman. Frank Mitchell was a fascinating character, a giant of a man, a huge man, a man who it said was so strong he could lift a grand piano single-handedly. He could carry two grown men, one in each hand. He was a giant of a man. His problem was he had the mental age of a child. He had a long career of violence and larceny, and he was in and out of prison and psychiatric hospitals. He was first arrested as a young boy for stealing another boy's bike and finished up in Borstal. When he came out, it was a succession, as I say, of prison and psychiatric hospitals. He first met Ronnie Kray in Wandsworth Jail and they became friends. And then later, of course, they met in Broadmoor Hospital for the criminally insane at Crowthorne in Berkshire. He was a violent prisoner, was Frank Mitchell, giving constant trouble to the authorities. He was sent to Rampton Psychiatric Hospital and then to Broadmoor Hospital for the criminally insane. When he was there, he spoke to Ronnie Kray and said, "Ronnie, I really want to get parole. I really want to be freed. I'm okay now. I've not done anything for years. Would you help me?" And Ronnie said, "Yes. We'll always help you. Don't worry about that, Frank." But then Frank escaped from Broadmoor. There was a massive hunt for him involving hundreds of policemen. He was finally apprehended. He was holding a married couple hostage in their home using an axe as a threatening weapon. And that's how he became known as the Mad Axeman. He was then sent to Dartmoor prison, one of the bleakest and toughest prisons at the time anywhere in the country. What he did there was quite extraordinary. His behaviour suddenly became extremely good. He became very well behaved, a really trusted prisoner, and the governor allowed him to work on outside working parties. It was quite extraordinary. Sometimes he'd go to a local pub for drinks and he'd bring booze back to the prison. This is all true. It's quite extraordinary. He would even take a taxi into Oakhampton to buy little birds, budgerigars for himself and other prisoners. And it said he even had a couple of girlfriends that he would visit as well. Well, the governor said to Frank Mitchell, "I'm going to try and get you parole, Frank. I think it's time." But the years went by, 4 years went by, and nothing had happened. Frank was getting extremely restless. So he sent a message to Ronnie Kray and said, "Ronnie, you offered to help me. You said you'd get me parole. Will you help me?" Ronnie had a chat with Reggie and said, "This would be quite a thing if we could pull this off. If we could get him out of Dartmoor, get him to London into a safe house in Barnes, then we're going to contact the Home Secretary, Roy Jenkins, anonymously of course, and ask him for parole for Frank Mitchell. We'll get parole for him and then he'll go back to Dartmoor, serve out his sentence and he'll be a free man again." Ronnie said, "This is going to make us look absolutely invincible." Reggie sort of went along with it and they decided they would try and free Frank Mitchell from Dartmoor. And I'm quoting now from Reg and Ron Kray's book, which I wrote with them, called Our Story. And this is how it all happened. Reg, says Ron, decided he would personally recce Dartmoor to see what the prospects were. So he wrote to the governor, using a false name, of course, asking him if he'd like a visit by the great ex-boxer Ted Kid Lewis, who'd give a talk to the prisoners about his boxing career and show films of his old fights. Ronnie continues, "We hired the films from a film distribution company in Wardour Street in London. We soon received a letter from the governor saying yes, he'd be delighted to see Ted and was thrilled that he'd be giving a talk to the inmates, to the prisoners. A few weeks later, Ted and 3 associates, i.e. Reg and 2 other East End villains with criminal records as long as your arm, made the journey by road to Dartmoor. Needless to say, Reg and his 2 companions had disguised themselves as much as possible, just in case. It was raining hard, so they were rushed through into the prison. The Dartmoor cons loved Ted. They thought he was marvellous, gave him a standing ovation. Ted wept with emotion, and by this time he was in tears. During the show, Reg and the other 2 associates were sitting in a gallery overlooking the stage and all the cons. They were in fact recognised by several of the cons, but still the warders didn't recognise them. After the show, says Ron, the governor and the padre took Reg, Ted and the others for a meal. The governor seemed to enjoy telling Reg about the various convicts he'd had under his wing. They even spoke about Frank Mitchell, whom the governor called a sad case. At the end of the meal, they all shook hands and parted. So Reggie and Ronnie decided he could be freed from Dartmoor, and they did it quite simply. A couple of members of the firm drove down at a pre-arranged time. Frank Mitchell was out working with a working party, said to the senior officer, look, can I just go over there and feed those ponies and give them some food? And the officer said, yeah, that's okay, Frank. Frank indeed walked across, but not to the ponies, but into this car which was waiting for him, and he was taken back to London, to a safe house in Barnes. Then a letter was sent to various of the national newspapers and also to the Home Secretary at the time, Roy Jenkins, asking for parole for Frank Mitchell and saying if he got his parole, he would willingly go back to Dartmoor to serve out a bit more of his sentence. Of course, Roy Jenkins and the government were having absolutely none of that. They wouldn't respond at all. There was a huge police search going on for Frank Mitchell, and the Kray twins now had a bit of a problem. This was supposed to make them look absolutely invincible, unassailable. But Frank Mitchell was becoming very restless, he was becoming more violent, and the Kray twins had this problem: what to do with him. Well, they couldn't really take him back to Dartmoor because that would incriminate them. So they decided that, well, something had to happen to Frank Mitchell. Now, Ronnie Kray said to me that in actual fact, Mitchell was taken out of the country to either Spain or South America. And as far as he was concerned, Mitchell was still alive. However, Freddie Foreman had a different story. In his autobiography, Respect, he says that he actually murdered Frank Mitchell. And what happened was, Mitchell was told, right, you're going to be taken by van to a safe house in the country, you're going to meet Ronnie Kray, and he's going to sort everything out for you. Mitchell got into the back of the van. Waiting inside for him were Freddie Foreman and another member of the Kray firm, and Mitchell was shot dead several times. Then, said Freddie Foreman in his autobiography, Frank Mitchell's body was taken down to the south coast, wrapped up in chicken wire and dropped into the sea, and no one ever saw Frank Mitchell's body again. Now, indeed, the Kray twins, Reggie and Ronnie, and Freddie Foreman and the Kray twins' older brother Charlie were all taken to court and charged with murdering Frank Mitchell, but in fact they were all acquitted because there were no witnesses and there was no body. So what happened to Frank Mitchell? Well, Ronnie Kray's got one version, Freddie Foreman's got the other, and I rather suspect Freddie Foreman's is the correct version. So a sad end to a rather sad man. That's it for this time, but I'll have some more stories of crime and criminals and gangsters and killers for you next time. I hope you can join me then.